Dme here with Unit 11, Information and Digital Skills. So, as we get to look at this topic, Information and Digital Skills, we need to understand how to define, identify, and also access and use information resources. Now, in this unit, what we are going to concentrate on the concepts that we are going to look at. We are going to first of all identify relative information. We are going to look at types of information resources and also searching for information resources. Now, we are mentioning two words here, resource and source. What would be the difference between information resource and information source? Now, here for clarification of the terms in the course, information source refers to where the information originates. Simply, where are you getting information? If it is on this particular subject, where did the information come from? And now that can be a person, it can be a place, or even a thing. So where just the very specific location of information from where it is coming from. That is the source of information. For example, where a river starts, we call that as the source of a river. So if I get income from my parents, I call the source of my income is my parents. So same where I get the information, if I'm talking about a certain subject where I'm getting it, that is the information source. Now, when you're talking about resource, source and resource will be different in this case. Information source is simply where we are getting the information, where the information is originating, where it's coming from. But information resource is more an asset where we are getting information. So it can be an asset of an institution or an organization where information is gotten. So information resource are categorized by the form of information which is being covered, the medium into which they are being placed in, and also the tools through which they can be accessed. So that would be now a resource. A resource goes deeper into understanding the assets themselves. Where are you putting the information? How can you access them? Where have you put them? So that would be the difference between a resource and the source of information. Source is simply where you are getting it, but resource will go deeper in understanding about the category of the information, the medium into which it is placed. It can be in form of a book and something like that, and also how can you access that information. So that would be a resource, but we need to understand that these two terms can be used interchangeably. Okay, now how do we identify that this is the important information? For example, when you are carrying out a literature research or an academic research on a certain subject, you want to understand something about this certain topic. Maybe you might be studying a certain topic in chemistry, you are doing atomic structure. Now, how do you understand that the information I need about this subject is this and this not? Because not every information that we found on social media, on these media platforms, is reliable. So we need to be able to understand what we need to find. And so to identify that this information is important is especially in today's world where we mostly do online researches. We are not more into getting to read books. Information tools and services can be overwhelming for research. So we can information can bring anything. Even Google itself can just bring anything that we research about. Even something which we are just posted because there are opinions of people, not because they are the truth, but just an opinion of a person. So information managers endeavor to provide support to researchers in identifying different types of sources, evaluating the originality of the source, advising which tools and resources to use, employing search techniques to retrieve the best search results, and evaluating the information resources. So we need to look at some of these things when we are trying to identify which information is relevant. So the first is we also need, it's very important for us to understand the information source. Where are we getting the information from? Are we getting the information from a reliable source? Because you can't just get information from any place. And the best information that you can get is from an expert. If I want to understand something about medicine, I shouldn't go to an engineer to look for information. I'll get wrong information. So I need to identify which one is going to be relevant information. And so we need to pay particular attention to all those aspects as we get to look for information. Now, in order to conduct an effective literature research, you need to be able to clearly know your information requirements, then translate them into an effective search syntax. In this way, researchers can identify the information sources available in the academic world and also be able to use the information tools to retrieve relative content. So what we are just saying here is, when you are conducting a literature research, for example, you want information on a certain subject, you need to know what information requirement you want to have. So what do you want to know about this kind of subject? Well, I gave an example earlier about atomic structure. So first you need to identify, what do I need to know about this subject? Is this a definition? Is this the different types of atoms? What do I want to know about that? And if I know what I really need to know about this subject, then that is going to help me to understand what kind of information source I need to go to and what kind of information tools I need to use. So information tools, well, this will just be what we are going to use for us to get the information. This can be Google, it can be books and such things. So depending on the information that we want to find. So that is one more important thing that we need to understand. Now, from this time, we need to understand the types of sources of information. So the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary sources of information. Now, sources are considered as primary, secondary, and tertiary sources based on their originality. So, just like we state, even when you are studying, for example, when you are taking understanding, you want to understand about proteins. You say proteins are on different levels. You've got the primary level, which is a very basic, which will just tell you of the basic construction of proteins. Those are just the amino acids which make up the proteins. Now you're going to go to the secondary level. Now you start looking at how do proteins fold. This primary structure, how is it folding? So you are now getting deeper and deeper into understanding that. So we can also relate in such a way on looking at information sources. Now, when you're talking about primary sources, these are just the first formal appearance of results. For example, when we are talking about the understanding of, let's say, phenotypes in biology, the first one who taught us about the understanding of phenotypes, we can refer to Mendel. So the work which Mendel did, that was the first formal appearance of the results which were collected. So the results which he collected, that would be called the primary source of information, because it was the first formal appearance of the results. They were not yet there. They were the first ideas which he had, or the first discovery which he had, and now we all use them to be able to make also some other conclusions from the work which he already did. So such information is called primary information from an original source, an idea, or a new discovery. Okay, so primary sources, they refer to where the new research or theories are first revealed. Where are we is this kind of information first revealed about a certain subject? Now they allow researchers to get as close as possible to their original ideas. If I am a person who is getting to research about a certain subject, so I'm researching about a certain subject. When I get to read now the very first thing which was said about that subject, as close as I can go to the original discovery which was made. So that is where primary sources of information can lead me to. As close as possible to the original ideas or the original events and the first hand research. So it will draw me closer to the first hand research when I'm making a research, when I'm using primary sources. Now, primary sources represent original search. An example is an interview, analyze field data, and then original experimental data or research, as I gave an example about Mendel's work. So that is on primary sources of information. What are the secondary sources of information? Well, secondary sources are interpretations and also evaluations of primary source of information. I'll refer again to Mendel's work. When Mendel did his work, it was first not accepted. But as people got to understand more and more, other scientists came up and they started to agree with, after evaluating the information of Mendel, after evaluating the researches of Mendel, they started to agree with the information which Mendel had to speak about. So they had to evaluate and also to interpret the data, because at first Mendel was presenting his work in forms of phenotypic ratios, genotypic ratios, and those things were things which were not accepted then in the field of biology, interpreting biology in terms of mathematical data. So when different scientists, such as the Morgan, they came up and did their also work on fruit flies, they came to evaluate the data for Mendel and said, yeah, this information is right. So secondary sources of information are simply interpretations, evaluations of primary resources. So they are going to analyze and also review. You get to look at what someone did and also summarize the information. When you are talking about a primary source, because we are making a first discovery, we are going to do a lot of things. And it can be very difficult for someone who wants to read it. And so a secondary information is going to present a primary information, but in a summarized way. So it will be much shorter than the primary source, because it's just a summary, a review, and also an evaluation. Okay, so secondary sources often rely on other secondary sources and standard disciplinary method to search results. So secondary sources represent an they represent an interpretation of indexing of the original search. An example that we can talk about is a review article. So an article that is written to review what was already discussed or something that was already found out. Such is an example that we can give as a secondary source. Okay. So an example of a review article that we can talk about is an article on the environmental impact of pollution. We already know, someone might have already spoken about the environmental impact of pollution, or we've already seen the impact of pollution, but someone just wants to summarize or just get to review about the impact of pollution on the environment. So such would be a secondary source. Now when you're talking about tertiary sources of information, this is going to consist of the information which is a concentration and collection of primary and also secondary sources. So you are going to get the primary sources, the secondary sources. Now when you concentrate on both of these, that is going to give you now a tertiary source. So tertiary sources often provide data in a convenient form or provide information within a context which can help the researcher interpret the information. So it wouldn't be that cumbersome for someone to get to interpret that information, because it is more in a summarized way. For example, this person has done a discovery, Mendel has done a discovery, and Morgan has also come to interpret his data. And now we are going to have these textbooks. These, we can talk of dictionaries, which get to interpret also the data which was again interpreted, to make it more in a simple way. Now we need to get this. Mostly primary sources are going to talk about just a certain subject. Secondary sources are going to also evaluate that same subject. But tertiary sources of information, they are going to analyze both of these and now combine with also other kinds of information and put it in one form of a book. That is why we end up with textbook. A textbook doesn't just contain one topic, it will contain a multitude of topics. So it is an analysis of primary sources, secondary sources, and now together that is going to form a textbook, an encyclopedia, compedia, and such things. So that is going to be a tertiary source of information. Now let's look at what the tertiary sources of information talk about, second sources of information, and also the primary sources of information. Now, when we talk of the tertiary sources of information, these are simply summaries and general information. So it will just be a summary, a very general summary, and just giving you general information. It might not concentrate only on one portion, maybe just talking about a certain information. So it might be just about on a lot of information. Okay. So what we can talk about is an encyclopedia, a dictionary, dry compedia, reference books, textbooks. All those are going to be tertiary information sources because they are just giving us a summary of everything together. Now, secondary sources of information, these are interpretations, indexing of original search. So you get to interpret the original source of information. An example that we can give is abstracting and indexing services. For example, a PubMed. Okay, we can talk of also bibliographies, we can talk of reviews, we can talk of meta-analysis. You're just trying to analyze the information which was discovered originally by a person. And this might not speak about just generally everything. It might just analyze something which was already discovered, just a certain subject which was already discovered, and not just everything else. And when we're talking about primary sources of information, this is the original source now. Original source that can talk about a conference poster paper, a journal article reporting original research, a case report, correspondence, and these other things. This is just a very original piece of information or a research, an idea, and then the rest will be interpretations now. Now, what is the advantage and the disadvantage of all these types of information? Well, as we have seen, now I'm going to start with the primary source of information. The primary source of information, because this is a new discovery, the information is the information is original. No one is going to put anything, add anything. This is more like you've done an experiment, and the experimental data will not lie. So this is the original thing without any interpretation, and the information is not biased. It is not only concentration on one part. It is just given fully. Okay. So now let's talk of the disadvantages. What was the disadvantages of this kind of information, which is the primary sources of information? What would be them? So disadvantages, the badness is that the data is too large. Okay, there are just too much large volumes of data. Because if you talk of a certain discovery, a person is going to talk about only one thing. For example, just getting about this certain discovery, only one. But for you to be able to finish the whole experiment, the conclusions that he made, the summary, and just everything about this experiment, it will just be too large for someone to read, especially when you are making a fast literature research. So that might be a sheer waste of time. So it will be time consuming. That is because the data is too much. Okay. Now, when you go to a secondary source of information, the advantage of secondary source of information is you are going to have rapid access to the information. Okay, there is the rapid access to the information, and generally the standards are high, especially when you're talking of journals. The standards are high. You are guaranteed that the information is true because it goes through a lot of summary analysis and so much evaluations and those things. Now, also the ability to perform complex researches. So secondary sources of information can help us to perform complex complex researches, because we are talking about secondary sources of information being evaluations and such things. So you are going to get to evaluate this data from the primary sources, and that will be a complex research, and that will make you to also get to understand about some other things you didn't understand because of a deeper and a complex research that you've taken. And also the routine updates on selected topics. So Secondary sources of information, they've got an advantage in that they are more updates. They are more updated. Okay, you get to update them more frequently. For example, when I'm talking about journals, a discovery is going to be made about something, but people are always evaluating information, and that is a routine update on selected topics, and those are going to be alerts for maybe just some changes which are happening in a certain field and such things. Now, the disadvantage of a secondary source of information is time lag. It can remain behind. For example, the information might just be just out of date, so it remains behind, especially where the world is in just more dynamic, where things are ever changing. So some information remains just practical in the past, and it remained true in the past, but for now it gets to change. The other thing is the command language can vary. For example, someone who had to evaluate a primary source of information, the primary source of information might be concentrating on one thing and trying to repeat one thing, but someone who gets to evaluate that information might just mention the point which was being concentrated on in the primary source just for one time, and hence the command language might vary from the original command language. Okay, and then also proficient search skills are needed for you to be able to understand what you are really looking for. You need to have a very big skill, because an evaluation, maybe when someone was getting to evaluate the primary source of information, the way they might have presented their information might need someone to be able to interpret so well. Otherwise, when you don't get to interpret so well the information which is there, it might be very difficult for a person who's getting to make a research to be able to get the information which is needed. And secondary sources of information can also be very expensive. When we're talking of journals, for you to be able to get such a journal and such things, it can be expensive. Now, when we are talking about tertiary sources of information, the advantage is it is easy to access. We can talk of dictionaries, textbooks. They're all over us, so it is very much easy for us to access, and it is very easy to use. In everything that we do in academic researches, we mostly use academic textbooks and such because they are easy to use, and the information is concise, meaning the information is short and to the point. So if you are talking about a certain subject, you don't need to read the whole primary source. You just need to use a textbook, and the information is just direct to the point and very short and easy to be understood. And it is relatively inexpensive. The information is very cheap. The source of information is very cheap. A textbook, a dictionary, those are very cheap. But the disadvantage is the time lag can be a disadvantage. They are behind time. They can be outdated. Because of that, that can be a disadvantage, because maybe a textbook which was written in the 1990s, when you are just talking about especially these new discoveries which are being made, especially in the medical field, you might read a book which was written in 1997 and applying it to the now, it can be different because there's a new discovery that has been made. For example, some books in the earlier times could have said there's no healing or there's no cure for this disease and such disease. But in the now, medicine has been discovered for such a disease. So find that information is out of date. And the information mostly is incomplete. When you just want to understand on a certain topic, I can take off just when you want to understand about water properties in biology. You are going to read this book, will just talk about maybe one property, two properties, and the course outline wants you to understand seven properties. So you have to go again to another book to get to read it and such a thing. So that is a disadvantage, incomplete information. And at the same time, you can have this book which is talking about everything, but just talking about one thing just in a sentence, the next subtopic in a sentence, and you want to understand deeper, you want to have more information about this thing. So It can be a bit tricky in such a way. And another thing is incorrect interpretation. The primary source of information might be talking about one thing, and someone who wrote this textbook might interpret the information in the primary source according to the way they understand it, and such can cause can cause incorrect interpretations, and when you get to read it you might end up reading wrong information, and those are the disadvantages and advantages of this type of information. So, we also need to understand academic and also popular information. As we can hear, academic information, this is the information that is presented in an academic sphere, more by experts in that sphere. But when we're talking about popular information, this is just the information that is presented, especially on social media, where someone is presenting such information is not even an expert. For example, people on social media, you can just hear this one saying, if you get lemon juice, mix it with this and this and this, take to drink it, it will give you this. Maybe it just did work for them by matter of chance, and they put it there, not because it is a matter of fact. So that will just be popular information. It might not just be academic information. So academic information has to be presented by someone who is an expert in a certain field. Okay. And then popular information can be presented by even a student. We can find more of these on YouTube, where just a student gets to present this video on what they just understand and such things. So just what they get to understand. Okay. So now the use of a higher level of language and more academic vocabulary applies and relates to this field. So what this field are we talking about? So let's read on top. Academic publications are written by professional or experts in a field, while popular sources, journalists, students, and popular authors write in popular sources. So it can be a journalist, a student, just an author. They might not be experts in that field. So those are going to write such information. Now, academic publications are for a specialized audience. When we're talking about an academic publication, you get to write it for a specialized audience. You don't just write it for everyone. Now, this audience, you need to be very careful when you are writing an academic publication, because the people you are writing to, or the information that you are presenting to those people, is the people who already have knowledge. These are people who are learned, people who are educated. So you need to be able to evaluate the information very well, because you're presenting it to people with already knowledge. Okay, and so you need to understand the kind of vocabulary that you get to present your work in, because you are presenting to people not who don't know anything, but people who are already learned. So the use of high level of language and more academic vocabulary applies and relates to this field when you are writing an academic presentation or an academic publication, or simply an academic information. So there you get to use vocabulary that applies to that field. For example, when you're talking about medicine, you use, when you're writing an academic publication on medicine, you are going to use the language that applies to people in the medical world, in the medical sphere. If you are writing about law, you are also going to use the law language. So there's a specific language that you need to use when you're writing an academic information, okay, or an academic presentation in this case. Now, when you're writing again this kind of information, academic information, or an academic publication, or an academic presentation, a reference list is always given and sources are cited. You want to give the reference list and these sources are cited, because like you are presenting to these people who have got knowledge about something. You want to make sure that everything that you tell them is something that is coming from reliable sources, because you just can't write a book and then you say, I've written this from the experience that my friend gave me, my friend told me about this. No, it should be from reliable sources. That is why it is always very important to cite references. And now, they are peer reviewed by editors who are scholars within that field. Academic information sources, they are also reviewed, they go through editing by people who are experts in that field. That's the between from just popular information. Now, types of information resources. So on the types of information resources, these are the ones which we have here. Well, we already said resource and source can be used interchangeably, though when we are talking about source, it's just where you are getting information. For example, a person, or simply just a place or a thing. But a resource would talk about even the assets and everything more deeper. So, but we get to use them interchangeably. So the types of information resource, we can talk of a newspaper. A newspaper is simply a collection of articles about current events which have been published, and these are daily published. We can talk of magazines. These are also information resources, and these are a collection of articles, images with different topics of popular interest and current events. And you can talk of also about trade journals. Now, trade journals are simply a collection of news, trends, things which are trending, articles for a specific industry written by professionals. So when you're talking about trade journals, these are written by professionals, experts, not just anyone who decides to write anything and get to post it. Another thing that you can talk of is an academic journal or a peer-reviewed journal. What about this? Okay, academic journal is simply a collection of articles written by scholars and peer-reviewed by experts in that field. Whenever we're talking about academic, it's not just written by anyone who thinks like writing it and then they get to post it. It's written by experts in that field. You will not find an engineer writing a book on medicine unless they're an expert in that field. You can also talk about a book, which is also called monography. So it can cover just any topic. It can cover a fact or a friction in a volume. So for research purposes, it is better to use books which are subject specific. When you are talking about this topic, when you are getting to have a research, for example, you need to understand the difference between praxia and also aphasia. So it is better not just reading a book which talks about general information. Better read a book that is going to give you more specific information about apraxia and aphasia. How do you get to differentiate them? These speech defects, how do you understand them and all those differences? Now we also have a thesis as as a resource, information resource. Now a thesis, or simply the dissertation, is a document containing the author's research and findings and is submitted by a student for an academic degree or professional qualification. For example, when you've got this assignment, they give you to research it. You make this research and you're going to present that information for an academic degree or simply a professional qualification. So that is a thesis. Another thing is conference proceedings. So these are simply collections of published papers presented at an academic conference. So whenever there is a conference, you are going to see a lot of papers talking about maybe what they are going to be talking about and start seeing. So those are also kinds of information resources. We also have reference materials. This can be reference encyclopedia, dictionaries, thesauri, and they are a collection of short factual entries written by different contributors. So these are supposed to be factual. When you're talking about a reference material, not something which someone is just making up a fiction or an idea of someone, it should be fact, proven by experiment and also confirmed by other experts. And also here to understand other types of information resource, it can be a report that is working or technical. So a report is simply separately published record of research findings, what you find out after you perform a research, and so you get to report your findings. Or simply a research in progress or other technical findings, usually classified with a report number and sometimes a grant number assigned by the funding agency. So when you get to perform a research about this subject, information that you find out, now you get to present it so that people can be able to witness what you found out. For example, you are working, you found this accident, so you now want to present your work of what you have seen. That would be a report. And we also have a patent, which is simply a government authority or license giving a right or a title Okay. For a set of period of time and the sole right to make, use, or sell an invention. So a patent is simply a government authority which is going to give licenses in a certain period of time when you want to do something. So just a right for you to get to do something. Maybe is that maybe a certain book that you want to write. You see that books have also copyrights and such in those angles. And another kind of source of information is a website. Websites, this we've used this many times when you want to search for information on social media. Those are also information resources where we get to find information. So, apart from that, we also need to understand access tools. Now, we have talked about information sources, information resources. We've understood them, but what are access tools? So when you start your research project, it is important to know where to find the information. You have got this research, you want a certain information about a certain subject. Where are you going to research from? So what type of resources are often offered in what kind of access service and platform? So all you're talking about is where do I get information? What kind of information is going to be given by this kind of source of information? So just talking about that is what we call access tools. Access tools are simply where we are able to get to access information. So in this lesson, these services and platforms are called access tools. So what are these we are referring to? So access service and platforms, what type of resources are offered in what kind of access tools, access services and access platforms. When you're talking about, you want to find out about a certain subject. Now, in that subject that you want to find out, you first identify where do I get information for me to get to understand about this subject. You are going to understand first where do you get that information. If you know the resource where you are going to get the information, and then you understand the services which are offered and what platform. So such is now what we refer to as the access tools. So it should be noted that they are not all free of charge. Just even on social media, when you want some information, you have to do some subscriptions for you to be able to get that information. Well, we can talk of free ones like YouTube, Google, those are free access tools. But there are others where there are some specific solved questions, and it is better to use those access tools which you need to pay before you get to access the information from, because you are guaranteed that the information is reliable, because most things which go on for free are not reliable information. Okay, now examples that we can talk about of access tools: library catalogs and discovery tools cover the library collection, including books, journals, and any other material. So through discovery tools, some separate from the catalog, some embedded technology, you can search across all the subscribed content by library. So we also have these online libraries. So these are also access tools. The online libraries, they can be just physical and things. So you can be able to subscribe and be able to get contents depending on the subject that you want to research about. And you also have databases. So these are also access tools. Apart from library catalogs, we also have databases. Databases are provided by the publishers for a fee, or sometimes even for free of charge. So they can cover articles, book chapters, proceedings, and reports. They are particularly useful in finding academic content on specific subjects. So this is simply where you can be able to get the data, which is going to be published or provided by a publisher. It can be either for free or for a fee. So it can cover a lot of things such as articles, it can cover books, database can cover these different kinds of books which you can be able to get when you pay or when it's just for free. So these are all access tools. And we also have repositories, which consists of academic institutions' output, including articles, proceedings, reports, and research data. So repositories are simply academic institutions' output. Maybe you've got this academic institution, so all their findings in a certain place, in a certain file, in a certain location. So that is a repository. It consists of a lot of things: articles, proceedings, reports, and all researches which have been made by an academic institution. Just like the University of Zambia, it might also have such, where if you want to get information about the institution, about the discoveries of the institution, you visit that kind of desk. I mean, access to. Okay. So we also